Imagine standing in a city that contains nearly 1 million people. You look around you and there are paved roads stretching to the horizon in every direction. There is fresh water flowing from carved stone fountains on every corner. There are bathhouses, libraries, theaters, markets, courts of law, and schools. The buildings tower offer you marble columns, bronze doors, glass windows imported from Egypt. The language spoken in the city is spoken in 37 modern countries today. The legal system of the city still forms the foundation of the laws in 52 nations on Earth right now. The engineering of the city won't be matched again for 1,000 years after it's gone. The city is Rome, and it is going to disappear. Not slowly, not peacefully, not because its people chose to leave or its rulers simply handed the keys to someone else. It is going to crumble from within, break apart from the outside, get poisoned from the ground up, and collapse under the weight of forces so enormous, so relentless, and so interconnected that historians are still arguing about what killed it 1,000 years later. And here is the thing that should genuinely unsettle you. We were taught in school that Rome fell because of barbarian invasions. That is the textbook answer. Across the world, students in classrooms open their history books and read roughly the same summary the Germanic tribes pushed in. The legions were too weak to stop them, and in 476 AD, the last emperor was deposed and the empire was over. The end. But that answer is almost completely wrong. Or at least, it is so incomplete that it might as well be wrong. Because the real story of why Rome fell involves pandemic disease that wiped out a third of the empire's population. It involves a climate event so catastrophic that it reshaped the ecology of an entire continent. It involves a financial collapse so severe that soldiers were being paid in currency worth less than the metal it took to mint it. It involves a political system so broken and so violent that in a single 50-year period, there were at least 26 different men who claimed the title of Roman emperor and almost all of them were murdered. It involves the slow poisoning of an entire ruling class. It involves the psychological unraveling of a civilization that had genuinely believed itself to be eternal. And none of that is in the textbook. So let's go back. Let's start at a moment when Rome was still everything, when the empire was still confident in its own invincibility. Because understanding why it fell requires understanding just how extraordinary it was to begin with and how quickly extraordinary things can stop being extraordinary when the invisible forces beneath them begin to shift. The year is 165 AD. The emperor is Marcus Aurelius, and the Roman Empire is at the absolute peak of its territorial reach. It stretches from Scotland in the northwest to the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq to the east. It encompasses the entirety of Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany west of the Rhine, all of Switzerland, Austria, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, Greece, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, and Morocco. Every coast of the Mediterranean Sea is Roman. The sea itself is Roman, they call it Mare Nostrum, our sea. Within that empire, roughly 70 million people live, maybe as many as 90 million. That is more than a quarter of all the human beings on the surface of the entire planet at that time. And those people are not simply surviving. They are participating in one of the most sophisticated economic systems the ancient world had ever produced. Trade routes connect cities from Britain to India. A merchant in Roman Alexandria could send goods that would arrive in Romagnoc within weeks. Grain from Egypt feeds the masses of Rome. Silk from China flows through Syrian trading posts and into the wardrobes of wealthy Romans. Spices from India season the tables of senators. This is not a primitive world. This is a world of complexity, of interdependence, of deep and intricate systems of cooperation that have taken centuries to build. And that complexity, that very sophistication, is part of what makes it so vulnerable to what is coming next. Because in 165 AD, something happens. A Roman army returns from a military campaign in the east from Mesopotamia, from what is now Iraq, and they bring something home with them that no one expected and no one was prepared for. The soldiers begin falling sick, not in small numbers, not gradually. They fall sick in waves, in masses, in entire units at a time. The illness spreads from the army into the cities the army passes through. It spreads from city to city along those same magnificent trade routes that had made Rome so wealthy. It enters every port on the Mediterranean. It follows the roads. What exactly this disease was, historians and medical scientists have debated for decades. The most likely candidates are smallpox or measles virus, something for which the Roman population had no more previous exposure and therefore no more immunity whatsoever. This means virtually everyone who is exposed becomes infected, and a significant proportion of those infected dies. The historian Edward Gibbon, writing in the 18th century in his monumental work The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, described Rome's fall as a long, slow process driven by internal weakness and what he saw as the softening influence of Christianity. But even Gibbon acknowledged that the plagues of the 2nd and 3rd centuries tore something fundamental out of the empire's foundations. Modern scholars have revisited those numbers and the estimates are stunning. In some regions, particularly in Egypt, where Roman census records survived, the population appears to have fallen by 25 to 30% in the first wave alone. In the city of Rome itself, during the worst of it, people were reportedly dying at a rate of 2,000 per day. 2,000 people, every single day, in one city. Marcus Aurelius watched it happen. He was a philosopher emperor genuinely, not just by title. His private journal, which we know today as the Meditations, is one of the most remarkable documents to survive from the ancient world. He wrote in Greek not for publication, but purely for himself. He wrote about duty, about the acceptance of suffering, about the insignificance of individual life against the sweep of time. He wrote about death with remarkable equanimity. And yet, even Marcus Aurelius, who had intellectually accepted mortality as natural and inevitable, spent the last years of his reign watching people die in numbers that defied philosophical composure. He also spent those years fighting wars on multiple fronts. Because the plague was not Rome's only problem. It never was only one problem. That is the most important thing to understand about the fall of Rome. It was never just one thing, it was always everything at once. While the Antonine plague, named after Marcus Aurelius' adoptive family name, ravaged the population of the empire, pressure on the northern borders was increasing. The Germanic tribes beyond the Rhine and Danube rivers had been served for centuries. They had always been served. Rome had always managed them through a combination of military force, diplomatic bribery, and the absorption of some Germanic peoples into the Roman army itself. It was a system that worked, more or less, as long as Rome was strong enough to make it work. But the plague had killed soldiers. Not just ordinary soldiers, experienced, trained, battle-hardened soldiers who had spent years learning how to fight in the disciplined, coordinated formations that had made Roman armies almost invincible. It takes years to train a professional soldier. Disease doesn't care about that investment. Disease kills the veteran and the recruit with equal indifference. So Marcus Aurelius was fighting wars with depleted armies while simultaneously trying to manage an empire whose tax base was shrinking because people who pay taxes tend to stop paying taxes when they are dead. He raised money where he could. He sold off imperial furniture and jewelry at public auction to fund military campaigns. He enacted emergency measures. He held the line. And when he died in 188, still in the field, still on campaign, the line held barely. His son, Commodus, became emperor. And here is where the story begins to get darker in ways that historians have described as almost operatic in their dysfunction. Commodus was not Marcus Aurelius. He was not a philosopher. He was not a statesman. He was a man who genuinely believed, or at least performed believing, that he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He renamed the city of Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He renamed the Roman legions after himself. He descended into the arena to fight as a gladiator, not symbolically, but literally, as a performer, which the Roman aristocratic sensibility was roughly as degrading as a president of the United States performing as a circus clown while in office. He was strangled by a wrestler in his bath in 192 AD, and his death triggered what historians call the Year of the Five Emperors, in which 5 different men were declared emperor within a single 12-month period, and the Roman Empire was effectively sold at auction to the highest bidder. Literally. A wealthy senator named Didius Julianus bought the empire at an auction held by the Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers who were supposed to protect the emperor but who had just killed the previous one. This is not a footnote. This is a symptom. This is the fever breaking through the skin, the empire showing the world that its central nervous system was beginning to fail. The political crisis that followed the century-long convulsion historians call the crisis of the 3rd century would push Rome to the very edge of dissolution. Between 235 AD and 284 AD, a period of roughly 50 years, the Roman Empire had at least 26 emperors recognized by the Senate in Rome. 26. Most of them reigned for less than 2 years. Most of them were killed, usually by their own soldiers or by rivals who then seized power and had themselves declared emperor until they too were killed. During the same period, the empire fractured into 3 separate pieces: a Gallic empire in the west controlling Britain, France, and Spain, a Palmyrene empire in the east under the remarkable Queen Zenobia, who controlled Syria, Egypt, and much of Asia Minor, in the rump of the original empire in the middle, fighting desperately to hold what remained. This was Rome, the eternal city, the civilization that had convinced itself and had largely convinced the world that it was simply not possible for it to end. And here it was, bleeding out across 50 years of unrelenting political savagery. But the political chaos was not the cause. Not really. It was a consequence. It was what happened when you remove stability from a system that depends on stability. And stability had been removed by something far more fundamental, far more silent, and far more dangerous: money. The Roman economy of the 2nd century was sophisticated enough to generate real surplus. Wealthy merchants accumulated capital. Senators invested in London trade. The state collected taxes in currency and spent that currency on the army, on public works, on the maintenance of the roads and aqueducts that held the empire together. The whole system functioned on the assumption that the currency, the silver denarius, actually contained silver. In the reign of Marcus Aurelius, the denarius was roughly 80% silver. By the time of Gallienus, emperor during the darkest years of the 3rd century crisis, the denarius contained approximately 25% silver. The rest was bronze, covered in a thin wash of silver that wore off almost immediately. The Roman government, facing the impossible cost of constant military crisis on multiple fronts simultaneously, had simply debased the currency. They minted more coins, more and more coins, each coin containing less actual silver than the last. This is inflation, not the gentle, managed inflation of our modern economy. This is catastrophic, uncontrolled, devastating inflation. Ancient Egyptian papyri preserve price records from this period, and they show that the price of wheat in Roman Egypt increased by a factor of 50 over a 100-year period. 50 times. A commodity that cost one amount in 200 ed cost 50 times that amount in 300 ed. What does that do to a society? Think about it practically. Think about what it means for a farmer trying to sell grain when the coins he receives for it are worth less each season. Think about what it means for a soldier being paid in currency that buys him less food every year. Think about what it means for the merchants and traders whose long-distance commerce depended on stable prices and predictable exchange rates. The whole magnificent interconnected trading system of the Roman world began to seize up. People stopped using currency where they couldn't, began trading in kind, exchanging goods directly for goods. Local economies contracted inward. Cities that had grown rich on trade became smaller. Some disappeared entirely. And while all of this was happening economically, while the politics were spiraling into blood-soaked chaos, while the population was still recovering from the first Great Plague and beginning to face a second one, while all of that was in motion, something else was happening that almost no more one at the time understood. The climate was changing. This is perhaps the most underappreciated dimension of Rome's fall, and it is one that has been brought into sharp focus only in the last 2 decades of scholarship, largely through the work of historian and classicist Kyle Harper, whose 2017 book The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End-of-An Empire synthesized an enormous body of recent paleoclimatological evidence, ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica, treating records, lake sediment data, and produced a picture of the Roman world's climate that is genuinely startling. For roughly 500 years, from around 200 BC to around 200 AD, the Mediterranean world and much of temperate Europe experienced what Harper calls the Roman climate optimum. Temperatures were slightly warmer than the long-term average. Rainfall was more regular and more reliable. Growing seasons were longer. Harvests were, in general, good. This benign climate was not the sole cause of Rome's rise. Rome's rise had 1,000 other causes, but it was the background condition against which everything else operated. It was the ground beneath their feet, stable enough that they could build on it without thinking too hard about what it was made of. And then, beginning around 200 AD, right in the middle of the political and military and economic crisis, the Roman climate optimum began to end. Temperatures began to fall. Rainfall became less reliable. Growing seasons shortened. Harvests became less predictable. None of this was dramatic from year to year. No more single harvest failure was obviously connected to a long-term climate shift. But over generations, the cumulative effect was enormous. Food became less abundant. Margins that had been comfortable became thin. People who had been well-fed became hungry. Populations under nutritional stress were more vulnerable to disease. Disease spread faster, killed more, and left behind weaker communities less capable of recovery. The ice cores from Greenland tell an additional story that is even more specific. Lead deposits in the ice. Roman smelting operations produced enormous quantities of lead pollution. They were the most significant polluters of the northern hemisphere atmosphere until the Industrial Revolution, which is itself a testament to the scale of their industry. The lead deposits in the ice cores trace the economic cycle of the Roman world with extraordinary precision. The lead levels rise during periods of growth and prosperity. They fall during times of crisis. And what the ice cores show is a series of dramatic collapses in Roman industrial activity that map precisely onto the political and economic disasters of the 3rd and 4th centuries. The physical evidence of Rome's decline is frozen in Greenland ice. It has been sitting there for 1700 years. But there is something else in those ice cores. Something that Harper and his colleagues have spent enormous effort analyzing. Volcanic aerosols. Evidence of massive volcanic eruptions that, in the ancient world as in every era of history, produced temporary but severe disruptions to global climate. Cold summers, failed harvests, famine. The 536 AD event, a mysterious catastrophe that may have involved one or more massive volcanic eruptions plunging the northern hemisphere into a years-long volcanic winter, happened long after the Western Roman Empire had already fallen, but its impact on the surviving Eastern Empire was devastating. The Justinianic plague, which swept through the Byzantine world beginning in 541 AD and recurred for the next 2 centuries, arrived on the heels of this climate shock. The timing was not coincidental, but let us come back to the Western Empire. Let us come back to what happened between the recovery of the empire under Diocletian and Constantine in the late 6th century and the actual final end in 476 AD. Because this section of the story is where the conventional narrative barbarian invasions, weak emperors, corruption is most incomplete, and where the reality is most fascinating. Diocletian was one of the most capable administrators Rome ever produced. He came from nothing, born to a family of slaves or freedmen in the Balkans, rose through the military, seized power in 284 AD, and immediately set about fixing the unfixable. He reformed the currency. He reorganized the army. He split the empire into administrative units that could be governed more efficiently. He created a system of shared rule, the tetrarchy, 4 emperors ruling simultaneously, each responsible for a different region. He controlled inflation with the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, a remarkable document that set price ceilings on hundreds of goods and services across the empire. It failed. Price controls without enforcement tend to drive goods underground rather than make them cheaper, but the attempt itself tells you something about how serious and how sophisticated Diocletian's understanding of the problem was. Diocletian also, famously, persecuted Christians. He is remembered in Christian tradition as one of the great villains, the great persecutor, and his campaigns against Christian communities were brutal and sustained. But here is something that is genuinely interesting about that persecution in the context of this story. One of the things Diocletian was doing, in attacking Christianity, was attacking an institution that was in the process of becoming a genuinely powerful rival to the state. The Christian church by the late 6th century had developed organizational structures, bishops, deacons, a network of local communities connected by correspondence and shared doctrine that in some ways paralleled and competed with Roman governmental structures. The church had accumulated property and wealth. It commanded loyalty from people across every social class and every region of the empire. Diocletian saw it as a threat to unity. He was not wrong about what it was becoming. He was wrong about how to respond to it. Constantine reversed the policy completely. His Edict of Milan in 313 had granted Christians and everyone else religious freedom throughout the empire. He later converted to Christianity himself, whether out of genuine faith, political calculation, or some combination of both that even he may not have been able to fully separate, is something historians will never definitively know. But the consequences were enormous. This brings us to one of the most controversial theories about Rome's fall, the thesis advanced by Gibbon himself in the 18th century and still debated with remarkable heat today. Gibbon argued that Christianity, by emphasizing the next word for this one, by directing the energies and ambitions of Rome's most talented and passionate people toward the monastery and the theological seminary rather than the battlefield and the Senate, fundamentally weakened the civic and military culture that had made Rome great. He argued that Christian pacifism, the genuine moral horror at violence and war that ran through early Christian thought, undermined the martial virtue on which Roman power depended. He argued that the enormous wealth flowing into the church drained the economic resources of the state. This argument has been attacked from many angles, and many of those attacks are valid. Rome's military problems predated Constantine's conversion by generations. The armies that failed to stop the Visigoths at Adrianople in 378 AD were largely composed of soldiers who were themselves Germanic pagans fighting under a nominally Christian empire. Christian theology had very little to do with their performance in battle, and some of Rome's most effective late military commanders were themselves devout Christians. The argument is too simple, but it is not entirely wrong either. The resources that flowed into church building, into the maintenance of a growing clerical class, into the construction of the magnificent basilicas and baptisterias of the 4th and 5th centuries, those resources came from somewhere. They came from an empire that was already under enormous fiscal pressure, and the psychological reorientation that Christianity represented, the shift from a culture in which civic service, military glory, and political participation were the highest expressions of virtue, toward a culture in which humility, withdrawal, and contemplation were elevated. This was not a trivial change. It happened slowly, over generations, and its effects are genuinely hard to measure, but they were real. What is perhaps more significant than the theological debate is what happened to the Roman ruling class specifically. The Roman aristocracy of the late 4th and early 5th centuries was extraordinarily wealthy. The great senatorial families of Rome owned estates that sprawled across multiple provinces. The historian Peter Hazard has described some of these estates as effectively self-contained economic units producing their own food, employing their own craftsmen, maintaining their own private armies, administering their own justice, effectively operating as small states within the state. This withdrawal of the aristocracy from genuine participation in the state is something that scholars across the ideological spectrum agree was significant. In the classical period of the Roman Republic and early empire, the wealthy were expected to spend their money on public games, public buildings, public benefactions of all kinds. This practice, called euergetism, was not purely altruistic. It was how wealthy men demonstrated their status and competed for honor and influence. It tied the interests of the rich to the well-being of the communities they dominated. It meant public infrastructure, a byproduct of elite competition. By the 4th and 5th centuries, that culture had substantially weakened. The rich built churches. They patronized bishops. They retreated to their country estates where they were insulated from the misery that was increasingly the reality of ordinary Roman life. The social contract that had, in better times, linked elite wealth to public benefit was fraying. And as it frayed, the state became less able to perform the basic functions: road maintenance, grain distribution, military recruitment that depended on both money and the willing cooperation of the propertied class. Now we come to the part of the story that most textbooks do actually get right, but get right in the wrong way. The invasions. The barbarians. The Germanic peoples who crossed the Rhine and Danube and ultimately tore the Western Empire apart. The conventional image of this is of a civilized world being swamped by savage outsiders. Primitive warriors breaking through the borders of a sophisticated civilization and burning what they could not understand. This image is wrong. Not in the sense that the invasions didn't happen, they absolutely did. Not in the sense that they weren't violent and destructive, they absolutely were. But the image of the Germanic peoples as simply external barbarian forces crashing against Rome's walls misses something crucial. The Germanic peoples had been in contact with Rome for centuries. They had traded with Rome. They had fought in Roman armies. They had been influenced by Roman culture, by Roman law, Roman Christianity, Roman material goods. Many of them genuinely admired Rome. Many of their leaders considered themselves heirs to Roman tradition rather than its destroyers. The Visigoths, the people who sacked Rome in 410 for the first time in 800 years, had been living inside Roman territory as federates, as legally recognized military allies, for a generation before the SAP. They had been brought in as refugees from the Huns, given land to settle, expected to provide military service in return. And then the Roman authorities had defrauded them, abused them, and driven them to desperate rebellion. The sack of 410 was not an invasion. It was a mutiny. The Huns are the real pivot point in this story, and they are often treated as a kind of external shock, wild, nomadic horsemen from the Central Asian steppe erupting into the story without context. But the Huns had context. They had been pushing westward for decades, driven by their own pressures: climate change on the Mongolian steppe that was reducing the pastural land their horse-based economy depended on, internal political dynamics that rewarded successful raiding and conquest. Attila, the most famous of the Han rulers, who came to power in 434, was not a mindless destroyer. He was a sophisticated diplomatic operator who used the threat of his military power as leverage in an extraordinarily complex political game involving the Western and Eastern Roman courts, various Germanic kingdoms, and dozens of competing factions. Attila understood Rome. He had Roman secretaries. He corresponded in Latin. He received Roman ambassadors and treated them according to Roman diplomatic protocol. The famous account of Priscus of Panium, a Roman diplomat who visited Attila's camp in 448, describes not a barbaric war camp but a sophisticated, if raffune, political court, one in which a former Roman citizen named Onegesius served as Attila's chief minister, and in which Priscus himself entered into philosophical discussion with a Greek merchant who had settled among the Huns and preferred their society to Rome's. The detail is worth pausing on. A Greek-Roman citizen meeting a Roman diplomat at the court of the most feared enemy of the Roman world, and explaining that he preferred to live among the Huns because the Romans had become so corrupt, so unjust, so incapable of protecting ordinary people from the predations of the powerful, that life under the Huns despite everything was actually better. That is the late Roman Empire. That is what it had become by the middle of the 5th century. The question that historian Brian Ward Perkins asks in his 2005 book The Fall of Rome and the End of Civilization is not simply why the Western Empire fell politically. He is not very interested in the sequence of depositions and usurpations that ended with the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposing the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, in 476 AD. What Ward Perkins is interested in is the material reality, what happened to the actual living standards of the people who lived in the former Western Roman Empire after Rome fell. And his answer is disturbing. They fell off a cliff. Ward Perkins and his colleagues analyzed the archaeological record across the former Western Empire with extraordinary care. Pottery, one of the most reliable indicators of economic complexity in the ancient world because pottery was produced industrially, shipped over long distances, and used by people at every level of society. What the pottery record shows for the late Roman period is a world of extraordinary economic integration. Mass-produced, thin-walled, standardized pottery of high quality made at specialist production centers and distributed across the entire Mediterranean world is found everywhere. In the homes of the wealthy and the homes of the poor. In cities and in rural settlements. across Britain, Spain, France, North Africa, the Balkans, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the material signature of a functioning, interconnected, sophisticated economy. And then it stops. In the 5th and 6th centuries, in the territory of the former Western Empire, it stops. The high-quality mass-produced pottery disappears. What replaces it where anything replaces it at all is locally made, coarse, thick-walled, irregular pottery, the signature of a subsistence economy. If communities no more longer connected to wider trading networks, if people who have lost access to the products of specialized, large-scale manufacturing, the pottery record, what Perkins argues, is telling us something about the living standards of ordinary people that the political narrative of kings and emperors completely obscures. And it gets worse. In Roman Britain, the evidence for what Perkins calls the end of complex life is particularly stark. Literacy. The ability to read and write had been widespread in Roman Britain, not universal, but common enough that writing was used in everyday commercial transactions, in letters, in legal documents, in hundreds of mundane ways that tell us about a literate, connected society. After the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 5th century, literacy essentially disappears from the archaeological record for 200 years. Coins disappear, wheel-thrown pottery disappears, large buildings disappear, the infrastructure of towns and roads falls into decay. People are living at a level of material complexity roughly equivalent to the Iron Age communities that the Romans had found when they arrived. This is not transformation. This is not the gentle evolution of one cultural form into another. This is collapse. Real, devastating, generations-long collapse. The people living in Britain in 600 AD were poorer, shorter-lived, less educated, less connected, and less physically secure than the people who had lived in the same place in 300 AD. That is not progress. That is the loss of civilization. But and this is where the story becomes philosophically complicated. The Eastern Roman Empire did not fall. Constantinople, the city that Constantine had built on the Bosphorus Straits to serve as the new capital of the eastern half of the empire, survived. It survived the fall of Rome. It survived Attila. It survived the Germanic migrations. It survived, in various transformed states, for nearly 1,000 years after 476 AD until the Ottoman Turks finally took the city in 1453. The historians who speak of the fall of Rome are really speaking of the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The eastern half, what historians call the Byzantine Empire, though the Byzantines themselves always called it the Roman Empire, went on. Why did the East survive when the West fell? This is a question that historians have debated at great lengths, and the answers are illuminating. Geography played a role. The eastern provinces were wealthier, more urbanized, and more economically productive than the western ones. The eastern frontier was difficult. The Sassanid Persian Empire to the east was a formidable military power that had been engaging Rome on roughly equal terms for centuries. But the Germanic migrations that devastated the West were primarily a Western phenomenon, driven by the Huns pushing westward across the steppe. Constantinople itself was protected by extraordinary fortifications. The Sidonian walls, built in the early 5th century, were arguably the most impressive defensive structure in the ancient world. But there is also something else. The Eastern Empire, from at least the time of Constantine, had a more functional political culture than the West. Emperors in the East were still murdered with depressing regularity, but the system was more resilient, more able to generate legitimate successors, more able to mobilize the fiscal resources of its wealthier provinces. The East had also, somewhat paradoxically, been better at absorbing and integrating the Germanic military class that was destabilizing the West. Eastern emperors were more ruthless about using, exploiting, and discarding Germanic federates rather than becoming dependent on them. The Western emperors, by the early 5th century, had effectively lost control of their own military. The real power behind the Western throne for much of the 5th century was held not by emperors but by military commanders who were often of Germanic origin. Men like Stilicho, who was half Vandal and who served as the effective regent for the Emperor Honorius, and Aetius, the last of the Romans, whose military genius postponed the final collapse for a generation. But these strong men, brilliant as some of them were, could only delay the inevitable. They could not reverse it. The fiscal base was too eroded, the population too depleted, the political culture too degraded, the military too dependent on federates whose loyalties were always contingent. And there is one more dimension to this story that we have not yet fully addressed. Lead. Beginning in the 1980s, a number of researchers began making a connection that, once made, seems almost impossible to have missed, and yet was genuinely shocking when it was first seriously proposed. The Romans used lead everywhere. They used it for water pipes. The word plumber comes from plumbum, the Latin word for lead. They used it for cooking vessels. They used it to line the storage containers for garum, the fermented fish sauce that was essentially the ketchup of the ancient world, used in enormous quantities in Roman cooking. And most significantly, they used it in wine production. Roman winemakers used lead vessels to boil down grape juice into a sweet syrup called sapa, which was then added to wine as a sweetener and preservative. Lead acetate, what we now call sugar of lead, is genuinely sweet. It genuinely works as a preservative. The Romans had no more reason to know it was slowly killing them. Blood lead levels among the Roman population, as reconstructed from skeletal remains and from ancient sources, appear to have been significantly elevated compared to pre-Roman and post-Roman populations in the same regions. The symptoms of chronic lead poisoning are relevant here: cognitive impairment, including reduced ability to think clearly and make sound judgments; behavioral changes, including irritability and impulsive decision-making; reduced fertility; increased susceptibility to other diseases. Some researchers have argued, and this remains controversial, but not impossible, that chronic lead poisoning among the Roman ruling class may have contributed to the erratic, self-destructive behavior of emperors like Caligula, Nero, and Commodus. The lead poisoning hypothesis has been criticized, and the criticism is legitimate. It is easy to overstate a case that depends on incomplete evidence, but it is not ridiculous. Lead was genuinely ubiquitous in the Roman world in a way it had never been before and would not be again until the Industrial Revolution. The idea that this had no more effect whatsoever on the population that was ingesting it continuously from birth is the position that would require extraordinary evidence to defend. So it is a strange circularity here that is worth contemplating. The fatty technology that made Rome great, the sophisticated metallurgy, the hydraulic engineering, the culinary refinement may have been quietly poisoning the civilization that produced it. The aqueducts that brought water to the cities brought it through lead pipes. The wine that lubricated the social and political life of the Roman upper class was sweetened with lead. Prosperity, in this reading, carried within it a slow poison. It is a metaphor almost too perfect to be history. But it is history. Now let us come to the end. September 4, 476 ed. The Western Roman Empire has one emperor left. His name is Romulus Augustulus, and he is a boy, perhaps 14 or 15 years old. He has been emperor for less than a year. His father, a general named Orestes, had placed him on the throne the previous year after deposing the previous emperor. He is a figurehead. He holds no more real power. He probably understands, in the way that intelligent children placed in impossible situations sometimes do understand, that what is happening around him is the final act of something enormous. The man who comes to depose him is named Odoacer. He is the leader of the Heruli, a Germanic people. He has been fighting in Roman service for years. He has decided, and this is the extraordinary part, that there is no more longer any point in maintaining the fiction of a Roman emperor in the West. The Eastern Emperor in Constantinople has already made clear that he considers himself the sole legitimate Roman ruler. The Western throne is, at this point, essentially ceremonial. Odoacer deposes Romulus Augustulus, sends him into comfortable exile at a castle in Campania with a pension, and declares himself king of Italy. He does not declare himself emperor. He does not claim to be Roman. He does not burn Rome or massacre its population. He administers that territory he now controls largely using existing Roman administrative structures, because those structures are still functional, and he is not an idiot. The Senate continues to meet. Roman law continues to be applied in Roman courts. The last Western Roman emperor retires to the countryside with an annual income equivalent to a minor noble and lives, as far as anyone knows, in reasonable comfort for the rest of his life. This is the end, not a dramatic sack, not a burning city, not a last stand of legionaries against a tide of screaming warriors. A paperwork change, a title transferred, a boy sent home. The anticlimactic nature of 476 ed is itself historically significant. The empire did not end with Abang because in many ways the empire had already ended long before. The real collapse had happened in the decades and centuries before: the demographic destruction of the plagues, the economic unraveling of the inflation crisis, the political disintegration of the said century, the ecological shifts of the changing climate, the social withdrawal of the ruling class, the progressive militarization of politics, the genuine material decline of ordinary life across the western provinces. By 476 ed, what Odoacer was abolishing was not really functioning. It was a name, an idea, the administrative shell of something that had already hollowed out. But here is what makes the fall of Rome so haunting, so persistently fascinating to everyone who studies it seriously. It is not that it ended. Everything ends. It is not even that it ended violently, because it did not quite end violently at the last end. The violence that contributed to its end was largely internal, Rome destroying itself long before anyone else got the chance. What is haunting is the memory. The people who came after the Franks, the Visigoths, the Anglo-Saxons, the Byzantine Greeks, they all remembered Rome. They remembered it, they invoked it, they claimed its inheritance. Charlemagne had himself crowned Holy Roman Emperor in 800 ed, more than 3 centuries after 476, because the memory of what Rome had been was still powerful enough that claiming its succession was politically worth something. The Catholic Church organized itself on the administrative template of the Roman Empire, with bishops corresponding to provincial governors and the Pope in Rome claiming a kind of universal authority that mirrored the universal authority of the emperors. The legal systems of nearly every country in Europe today descend, however distantly and indirectly, from Roman law. And those Greenland ice cores, those 3 rings, those fragments of pottery in the British Mood, they are still, sir. 17 centuries after the last Western emperor was deposed, the physical evidence of what Rome was and what its collapse cost is still present in the world. The lead in the ice, the gap in the literacy record, the absence of wheel-thrown pottery in 6th century Britain. These are not metaphors, they are measurements. They are the instruments of a civilization telling us, in the language of chemistry and the dendrochronology and the archaeology, that something real was built and something real was lost. And now 17 centuries on, in a world of extraordinary technological sophistication, of interconnected global trade, of complex financial systems, of environmental stresses and the political dysfunction and the subtle erosion of civic culture, the question that Rome forces us to ask is one that no one who looks seriously at this history can comfortably avoid. What makes us think we are different? Not because collapse is inevitable, not because there is some iron law of history that says every civilization must follow Rome's path, but because the mechanisms that brought Rome down, the vulnerability of complex systems to compounding crises, the way that economic inequality erodes civic cohesion, the way that climate stress amplifies every other kind of stress, the way that disease exploits the gaps created by poverty and the political dysfunction, the way that a governing class can convince itself that its comfort and the continuance matters more than the health of the system it depends on. None of those mechanisms have been abolished. None of them have become obsolete. Rome believed it was eternal, not as a vague hope or a political slogan, but as a genuine conviction, embedded in its culture and its religion and its literature. The word Roma spelled backwards is amor love. The Romans saw their city and their empire not just as a political entity but as something cosmically necessary, something that had to exist because the universe required it. Their poets wrote of an empire without end. Their philosophers argued that Rome was the fulfillment of human history. Their emperors had themselves worshipped as gods because anything less than divine seemed inadequate to describe what Rome had achieved. And the city had stood for 1200 years by the time Odoacer's men walked through its gates. 1200 years. If you are standing in Rome and you look at the Pantheon still standing, still structurally intact, still one of the best preserved ancient buildings on us, you are looking at a building that is older, relative to the fall of Rome, than the fall of Rome is. To us today, the Romans had every reason to believe in their own permanence. They had earned the right to that confidence by surviving everything that history had thrown at them for century after century. And it still wasn't enough. That is the truth that they don't teach you, not because the teachers are hiding it, but because it is too uncomfortable to sit with. It is not that Rome was brought down by barbarian savages who were simply stronger. It is not that Rome fell because its emperors were incompetent or its citizens immoral or its army insufficiently funded. Those things were factors. They were real. But the deepest truth about Rome's fall is that it was brought down by the compounding weight of multiple crises arriving simultaneously in a system that had become too large, too complex, and too internally conflicted to manage them. It was brought down by a climate that shifted beneath it, by diseases that traveled its own magnificent roads to find it, by a currency it poisoned with its own desperation, by an aristocracy that chose comfort over sacrifice, by a political culture that had forgotten how to produce competent leaders because the consequences of incompetence had not, for so long, been fatal. Rome did not fall because it was weak. Rome fell because it was strong enough for long enough to forget that strength is always conditional, that complexity always creates fragility, that the very systems that sustain civilization, the trade routes, the supply chains, the institutional structures, the accumulated human expertise are also the pathways along which disruption travels when disruption comes. The silence in Britain after 410 AD is perhaps the most eloquent testimony to all of this. The silence in the archaeological record where literacy used to be, the coarse pottery where fine pottery used to be, the empty spaces where the roads are still Roman roads that lasted 1,000 years after the empire that built them was gone but where no more wheels are turning anymore. That silence is Rome's real legacy, not the Pantheon, not the Forum, not the Colosseum, not the Justinian Code or the Latin Mass or the concept of republican government that the American founders borrowed from Roman history when they sat down to design a new nation. All of those things are real and important, but the silence, the sudden, devastating silence of our world that had learned to talk in one language and then lost the ability to speak at all. That silence is the thing that Rome is trying to tell us across 17 centuries of time. The question is whether we are listening.